There comes a moment in many people's lives when they realize the story being told about them no longer matches the truth of who they are. And yet, somehow, that distorted version begins to spread, to take root in the minds of others. This is not slouchy. It is often a deliberate psychological maneuver. As Carl Jung observed, people project what they cannot confront within themselves. When someone feels threatened by your independence, your integrity, or your refusal to be controlled, they may attempt to reshape reality itself. Starting with your image, you are not attacked directly, because that would reveal too much. Instead, the narrative is quietly adjusted. Small omissions here, subtle exaggerations there. They frame your boundaries as arrogance, your silence as guilt, your strength as hostility. And over time, this carefully crafted illusion begins to replace the truth in the eyes of those who were never close enough to see it clearly. What makes this especially insidious is that it exploits a fundamental aspect of human psychology. People believe what they hear repeatedly, especially when it comes wrapped in emotional certainty. The louder the confidence, the less the scrutiny. And so, without ever raising your voice, you find yourself cast in a role you never auditioned for, the villain in someone else's story. But here is the deeper truth. This says far more about their inner conflict than it does about your character. It reveals a need to control perception, to avoid accountability, to escape the discomfort of self-examination. In trying to diminish you, they unknowingly expose themselves. And while it may feel unjust, even disorienting, to be misunderstood in this way, it is also a moment of profound clarity. Because once you see the mechanism, you are no longer trapped inside it. You begin to understand that not every accusation deserves a defense, and not every story deserves your participation. In the end, the question is not why they created the illusion, but whether you will continue to live inside it or step beyond it and let truth speak for itself. There is a peculiar misunderstanding that arises when a person chooses silence in the face of accusation. In a world that often equates noise with truth, your restraint is not always seen as strength, it is interpreted as admission. You refuse to engage in chaos, to defend yourself in every corner where your name is being distorted. And yet this very refusal becomes part of the story others tell about you. It is a paradox that many fail to recognize. Dignity, when misunderstood, can be mistaken for guilt. As Carl Jung suggested, what remains unconscious in people tends to shape their judgments. Most individuals are uncomfortable with ambiguity. They seek quick conclusions to resolve their inner tension. So, when they see you standing still, not reacting, not arguing, not trying to prove yourself, they fill in the silence with their own assumptions, and more often than not, those assumptions reflect their fears, not your reality. But your silence is not empty. It is intentional. It is the discipline of someone who understands that not every battle deserves their energy. To constantly defend yourself against distortion is to become entangled in it. And once you are entangled, you are no longer operating from truth, but from reaction. Silence, in this sense, is not passivity. It is control. It is the refusal to let others dictate the terms of your self-expression. Yet this choice carries a cost. There will be moments when you feel unseen, when the weight of false perception presses against your sense of identity. You may even question whether speaking out would be easier, whether lowering yourself into the noise would bring relief. But relief is not the same as resolution. True clarity is not achieved through louder arguments, but through consistency of character over time. Because eventually, what is real begins to separate itself from what is performed. People may doubt your silence at first, but they cannot ignore your patterns forever. Truth does not need urgency, it requires endurance. And so the real question becomes this: will you break your silence to satisfy their misunderstanding, or will you let your life speak until their illusions can no longer stand? There is a particular kind of pain that does not announce itself loudly, yet lingers far longer than open conflict ever could. The pain of being misjudged. It is subtle, often invisible to others, but deeply unsettling to the one experiencing it. When someone assigns you a role that contradicts your true nature, it creates a fracture within your sense of identity. You begin to feel as though you are standing outside your own life, watching a version of yourself that you do not recognize being accepted as truth. What makes this especially difficult is that it does not attack your actions. It questions your essence. It suggests that who you are, at your core, is something other than what you know yourself to be. And over time, if left unexamined, this external narrative can begin to echo internally. You may catch yourself wondering whether there is something you failed to see, something you missed, some hidden flaw that justifies the way you've been portrayed. As Carl Jung often emphasized, the greatest psychological danger is not the judgment of others, but the moment we begin to internalize it without awareness. Because once you accept a false label, even partially, it starts to shape your behavior. You hesitate more, you explain yourself unnecessarily, you shrink in spaces where you once stood firmly. In trying to disprove the illusion, you slowly begin to live inside it. And yet, this pain, as disorienting as it may be, carries within it a profound opportunity. It forces you to confront a deeper question. Who are you when no one is watching, when no one is watching, when no one is validating, when the world seems to misunderstand you? It pushes you beyond external approval and into internal clarity. And that clarity, once established, becomes unshakable, because the truth of your character is not determined by perception. It is revealed through consistent alignment between your values and your actions. Others may misinterpret you, distort you, even reject you, but they cannot redefine you unless you allow them to. So the real danger is not that they misunderstood you, it is that you might begin to misunderstand yourself. There is something deeply unsettling about watching a false narrative take hold while the truth remains quiet, almost invisible. It can feel as though reality itself has been inverted, that what is real is ignored and what is fabricated is accepted without question. In those moments, the natural impulse is to rush in, to correct, to expose, to force clarity upon a situation that seems to have drifted too far from honesty. But truth does not operate on urgency. It does not compete for attention in the same way that illusion does. As Carl Jung observed, what is authentic carries a different kind of weight. It does not need constant reinforcement because it is rooted in something deeper than perception. Lies, on the other hand, require maintenance. They must be repeated, adjusted, defended, and in that constant effort to sustain them, cracks inevitably begin to fall. Mia. Time plays a crucial role here. Though it is often misunderstood, people think of time as passive, as something that simply passes. But psychologically, time reveals patterns, and patterns are difficult to disguise. Someone can manipulate a single moment, distort a specific event, but they cannot consistently maintain a false identity without contradiction. Eventually, behavior exposes intention. Inconsistencies surface. The story begins to unravel, not because it was directly attacked, but because it could not sustain itself. This is why patience is not weakness. It is strategic clarity. When you resist the urge to react impulsively, you allow the truth, the space it needs to emerge on its own terms. And when it does, it carries far more credibility than anything forced or defended in haste. People begin to notice what they once overlooked. Doubt enters where certainty once existed. And slowly perception shifts. But this requires trust, not in others, but in the nature of truth itself. It requires you to endure the discomfort of being temporarily misunderstood without abandoning your alignment. Because the moment you compromise your integrity to speed up the process, you weaken the very truth you are trying to reveal. So the real question is not whether the truth will come to light, it is whether you have the patience to let it arrive without betraying who you are in the process. At a certain point, something begins to shift, not around you, but within you. While others remain preoccupied with maintaining a narrative, you are confronted with a different task entirely: the quiet, often uncomfortable work of growth. And this is where the dynamic changes in a way that is not immediately visible, but profoundly decisive. Because while they are investing energy in perception, you are investing in transformation. This is not a dramatic process. It does not announce itself with grand gestures or instant validation. It happens in private moments when you choose discipline over reaction, clarity over confusion, purpose over resentment. Each of these choices may seem small in isolation, but over time, they accumulate into something far more powerful than any argument you could make in your defense. They become evidence. As Carl Jung emphasized, the individuation process, the journey of becoming who you truly are, requires a separation from external definitions. It demands that you stop seeking confirmation from those who have already misjudged you. And instead, you begin to align your actions with your internal standards. This is where real authority is formed, not in what you say about yourself, but in how consistently you embody your values. What is often overlooked is that people may ignore words, but they cannot ignore patterns. Over time, your behavior begins to contradict the image that was created about you. The consistency of your actions starts to create a quiet tension in the minds of those who believed the false narrative. They begin to notice the gap between what they were told and what they observe. And that gap becomes impossible to ignore. But this only works if your growth is genuine. If it is driven by a need to prove others wrong, it will always remain dependent on their perception. True growth, however, is independent. It is not concerned with correcting the past, but with building a future that speaks for itself. And that is where your real power lies, not in defending who you were, but in becoming someone whose truth no longer needs defense. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, the direction of consequence begins to reverse. What was once projected outward, blame, distortion, accusation, starts to circle back to its source. Not through revenge, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, unavoidable mechanics of reality asserting itself. Because no matter how carefully constructed a false narrative may be, it carries within it a fundamental instability. It depends on control, and control, over time, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. There is a psychological principle at work here that Carl Jung often alluded to. What we refuse to confront within ourselves does not disappear. It manifests externally and eventually returns with greater force. Those who distort others to protect their own image are, in essence, postponing an internal reckoning. And postponement is not resolution, it is accumulation. At first, their version of events may have seemed convincing, even dominant. But as time passes, inconsistencies grow more visible. Their need to reinforce the story becomes more obvious. They contradict themselves, not because they intend to, but because maintaining an illusion requires constant adjustment. And people begin to sense this, not always consciously, but intuitively. Trust erodes, questions emerge, and the very narrative that once elevated them starts to undermine their credibility. What is crucial to understand is that this downfall is not something you create. It is something they initiate and sustain until it collapses under its own weight. If you were to interfere prematurely, you would only entangle yourself in the same instability.
But by remaining grounded, by refusing to participate in distortion, you allow the natural consequences of their actions to unfold without obstruction.
And this is where the deeper resolution lies. Not in witnessing their fall, but in recognizing that you were never truly diminished by their story to begin with. What they attempted to take from you was never theirs to control. Your character, your integrity, your alignment with truth. In the end, people do not fall because they were exposed. They fall because they bar themselves on something that could not endure.